look, if we're leveling up on these levels, here's one of the things that I've learned about leveling up is part of the process of doing this is healing and deepening our relationship with ourselves, right? What keeps people at lower altitudes in these levels is insecurities and limiting beliefs and fears. And so at the end of the day, if we want to be this high-level, elevated leader, that's this gardener-minded leader, we probably need to do some work on healing our relationship with ourselves at a foundational level. And we can come back to the gospel. What's the purpose of the Christ's atonement? Is to help us foster that healing so that we could be more value creators.
Hey everyone, this is part 2 of my interview with Ryan Gottfredson. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, definitely go back and listen to that because there's a lot of context that will be important in order to understand fully this part 2, but a phenomenal discussion. You're going to love it. So here's part 2 of my conversation with Ryan Gottfredson.
We've said the value that we want is the value of just speak up, speak what's on your heart. Maybe that's our value. And we've expressed that, and I see, if I'm a leader and I see somebody not speak up, then I now have the opportunity to kind of after class put my arm around and be like, I saw you biting your tongue. Mm-hmm. Can we chat? One, because I'm going to create some space for them. But then in that chat, then I would say, hey, next time, could you not bite your tongue?
Yeah.
Because I think everybody else would benefit from that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. There, you establish safety, psychological safety, which you talk a lot about, right?
Yeah.
And it just and we grow, we flourish under that. Another concept that I think of when we consider, establishing value, sometimes we feel like we have this knee-jerk reaction in the church setting of like we want to emphasize Jesus Christ, right? Like, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Or we teach doctrine here. We want to focus on doctrine, and we sort of get these blinders on of like doctrine, Jesus, right? Which, sure, I mean, it should be at the core of everything we do, but then when we talk about values, we just say things like, well, we invite people to come to Jesus Christ. That's our value. All right, moving on. Like, well, wait a minute. Like, what does that look like in real life? Or give me a dilemma where that would actually be helpful in stimulating a Zion community or establishing unity, right? So to not just be satisfied with sort of these platitudes of like, well, we invite people to Jesus Christ. We focus on doctrine. Like, what does that mean? Like, how can we get to the value? Anything else come to mind with that?
Well, along those lines, because a lot of that idea of like the doctrine piece comes up in our teaching. So, right, I think a common dilemma that teachers experience in the church is, do I need to like cover certain topics do I need to cover all the topics in the lesson manual, or do I need to get all the way through my lesson? Or if somebody takes us on a tangent where they ask a question and it takes us on a completely different topic, but it is incredibly authentic, vulnerable, and growth promoting, where do we want the teacher to lead? Do we want the teacher to kind of run with that person who's kind of stepping into this vulnerable space? Or do you want the teacher to say, okay, great comment. That's not the direction we're going to go. I'm going to reel us in because I've got 4 other topics I've got to finish, right? So it's, where do we want people to lean in teaching? Do we want them to lean towards kind of downloading information and content? Or do we want them to lean into vulnerability, experiences, etc.?
Yeah.
Right? That could be another place for a value.
Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just thinking, sort of workshopping this in my mind of like, how can I present this to my elders quorum of, because it's easy, or it's sort of might fall flat to stand up and be like, okay, what are our values, or what type of values do you want to see in the quorum? It's almost, you almost get the wheels spinning more in people's mind when you start with some dilemmas. All right, here's a dilemma.
Exactly.
Here's a hypothetical. How would you respond if somebody started crying in this room right now, or someone got angry, or, and you can process before, that gathering, what those dilemmas are. And then as you workshop a dilemma in that setting, you can then say, all right, I see some values popping up here. How do you feel about these? Right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're spot on. Is you start with the dilemmas, or another way to kind of approach that is, do you ever feel torn and you're like between two different directions, like on where to go, right? So that would be the place to start, is surface the dilemma in one of those fashions, and then okay, what's a value that is going to best direct us moving forward?
Yeah, really good. All right, number 5.
All right, number 5, and we've kind of already touched on it, but the fifth thing that these really elevated leaders focus on is creating a psychologically safe culture. They are intensely focused on the culture. I used this terminology earlier. They are gardener-minded leaders. So gardeners understand 3 things. They understand that they cannot force a seed to sprout, a plant to grow, or a tree to bear fruit, but they can create the conditions under which those things will occur. And the better the conditions, the greater the growth and the greater the yield. And so at the end of the day, these most elevated leaders are way more focused on ensuring that the conditions in the environment are optimal for growth and for thriving. They're not as focused on the outcomes because they know those outcomes will take care of themselves. And so but we should have in mind, because we've got the purpose, mission, vision, we should know where we want to go, and we should be able to ask ourselves, what is it? And we should be asking, what is it about our current culture that is holding us back from fulfilling our purpose? And that is a question we should ask over and over and over and over and over again, because there will always be an answer to the question. And if we stop asking that question, we stop gardening. So we've got to ask, what is it about our environment, our culture, that is holding us back from our purpose? So that's another reason why we start with purpose, is we got to know the why.
Yeah, it's such an important question. And sometimes I appreciate you like emphasizing this question. We need to keep asking ourselves almost every week, at least, because I think this is what's so powerful when there is like a bishopric change, a stake presidency change, elder, relief study president change, where you get new, fresh blood coming into that, fresh perspectives, and they start with that question naturally because they think, or some type of question that's related to that. They're like, how are we going to do this, right? And unfortunately, some of these callings, like you think of a typical stake presidency calling, that's a good 9 years. By year 4 or 5, you're sort of in the mode of the MO of things and doing the things. Got another stake conference. Well, let's do kind of like the last one with a new theme. And but if we intentionally say no, let's start as if this is our first week. What would we see that needs to change here? I think that was in a book, one of those. Who are the brothers that write those leadership books, like Making Things Stick?
Chip and Dan Heath.
Yeah, the Heath brothers, right? I think it was in the Making Things Stick, but there was this like this business wasn't going well.
And there's Liz Wiseman does Ricky Smarts.
Oh yeah, right. But they asked themselves this question of like, if we were the like, we're going to get fired. We know that if we don't shape up, but how would we respond if we were the new CEO or the new executive team coming into this? And it totally shifted their point of view to the fact that they didn't get fired and they had great results going forward. So
the question that we're talking about here is largely asking over and over again, what is it about our culture that is holding us back from our purpose? So I'm going to make the stance that I don't think a lot of church leaders ask that question, or at least they're not kind of taking it seriously in terms of like following up on it. And so I think a valuable question is to ask is, why don't more church leaders ask that question? And it comes back to our 3 levels.
Okay.
So leaders who operate in that base level, they are wired to protect their safety, their comfort, and their belonging. When you ask the question, what is there about our culture that is holding us back from our purpose? Inherently, in asking that question, you're giving yourself a job to do, to fix something or change something in a way. And when we give ourselves a jobs to do, that doesn't generally feel very safe, very comfortable, or necessarily like we're going to fit in. We're just adding one more thing to our busy plate.
Yeah.
And so I think part of what we need to recognize about it is about our church system, which there are some massive pros and there are some massive cons. But when we have a lay ministry, then that means we've got people who are busy people who are already busy being asked to do busy things. And then the idea of doing these 5 things that we're talking about just feels like it's adding on to what we're already doing.
Yeah.
Right. So the reality is that this is my perspective. Most church leaders are incredibly good people, but also most church leaders operate in this mode of self-preservation.
Yeah.
How do I protect myself from more work? And their bodies are just more focused on preserving themselves than they are about creating value. And I think a lot of church leaders would say otherwise. They would verbalize, no, I'm all about creating value. But then I would ask, how often are you asking this question about what about our culture is holding us back from our purpose? Are you even focused on developing a purpose, mission, vision? What values have you espoused and tried to promote within this group, right? If leaders aren't doing those things, that's an indication that they're operating in self-preservation mode. And so I want to empathize with church leaders because I understand. Like, I get why leaders in the church operate in self-preservation mode.
Yeah.
But that's not the level of leadership that I think we should aspire to.
Yeah. Yeah. My mind goes to, like, it's sort of like saying a lot of the time, bad leaders are bad leaders because they're human. And guess what? You're human. And so if you're sometimes a bad leader, well, hey, I'm human too. Let's let's hug it out. Like, it's like, we just have to recognize, yeah, we're limited or we have a lot going on. And I appreciate that empathy statement of saying, like, we get it. Like, it's not like Ryan has it figured out or Kurt's got it figured out. If you just do it our way, This is just the messiness of mortality. But the more we can reach for these principles that we've discussed, then we're going to start to see progress. And then it's like, oh, this is getting easier and people are enjoying this. There's a good culture here. I'm looking forward to going to church. I love this calling, right? Like, those are the progress that we see. So,
and if we can, we've kind of been drawing a comparison from the corporate world to the church world. And the reality is in an organization, the CEO is paid a massive amount of money to do this work. In a church, the bishop or the stake president is not paid any money to do this work.
Yeah.
And you could even think about different churches. They have a ministry.
Yeah.
They have a pastor, a priest, a ministry that is paid to do this work. And while there can be a downside to a paid ministry within an ecclesiastical setting, it does create more. It creates a more optimal condition for leadership effectiveness.
Yeah.
And that we just is. That is a part of the constraint within our current church structure.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying we should change that church structure at all. I'm just recognizing it as a constraint to elevated leadership.
Yeah. So essentially you're saying, like, that stage 1, the safety and comfort, like, we are naturally, the natural man inside of us wants to create that safety and comfort and make sure that we don't look terrible as a leader. And so we naturally may go to that level 1 type of approach, just because it's like, you know what, I just have to do 90% of this work, even if I get burned out, because I don't want this to look bad on me. I'm the Elders Quorum president. I'm really excited president. I should be able to make this work. And then that's when we get stuck in that level 1.
Yeah. I do find that a lot of church leaders, and I've been there before too, so I'm as guilty as anybody. I do find that a lot of church leaders are much more concerned about not messing up in some way than they are about creating value.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that I saw this, it was many years ago. I was Sunday school president, and I approached our bishop, said, I've got an idea for an alternative Sunday school class. It kind of isn't what, is prescribed by the church, but I think it meets a need for a certain demographic in our church. And I felt like I had pretty good backing and rationale for the inclusion of this particular class. And it was a very quick no. And it just made me wonder, like, what, like, why such a quick no? Why not even a little bit more discussion? I'm not bent out of shape that it was a no, but it seemed like the bishop was more about focused on protecting his potential backside if something were to go wrong than he was about the value that could potentially be created.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's where, there's so many, that's when the person feels, whether you felt this way or not. But, if we come back too fast with that no, we start to diminish our ward council, right? And
Yep.
if as far as the bishopric goes, like if you have a diminished or disengaged ward council, it's going to be such an uphill battle, right? So you're always thinking like, yeah, go for it, lean in. How'd it go? Ooh, like that was crazy, wasn't it? Like, what did you learn? What'd you take away, right? And because it might fail, but we have to be, out of that stage one to be okay with it sort of crashing and burning.
Yeah, and when I study leaders like Satya Nadella at Microsoft, another good one is Ed Catmull when he was leader at Pixar Animation and Disney Animation, is the value, they actually created values around this particular dilemma. Do we kind of protect our backside, or are we willing to try something innovative and creative and new? And their value statement was, let's jump towards innovation. And in making that value statement, they are implicitly saying we know missteps are going to happen. Problems are going to occur by doing this new innovative stuff. And we are okay with problems. And we are even okay if those innovative steps fail. Because what we believe is that we're going to learn something in the process of implementing that new idea that allows us to ultimately be better off because we tried, as opposed to if we didn't try.
Yeah.
And Netflix is another example. So here's some really great books.
Okay.
If people, is that okay
Yeah,
if I just share some book recommendations? If people want to study really vertically developed leaders, these are the best books that I've come across. So Hit Refresh, which is about Satya Nadella and Microsoft. American Icon, which is about Alan Mullally at Ford. No Rules Rules, which is about Reed Hastings at Netflix. Creativity Inc., which is about Ed Catmull at Pixar Animation. And then a new one, here's a new one that I love. Those are ones that I maybe given before. But there's a great book called Unreasonable Hospitality.
Oh, yeah, I've read it. Yeah.
Yeah. So those, in my mind, those are maybe the best books for studying elevated leaders.
Yes.
And how they implemented all 5 of these practices that we've talked about.
Perfect. Yeah, and that's the thing is, it's not like you can listen to this 10 more times and yeah, if you feel the urge, please do. But, and then like, it's, Ryan didn't give us like the 5 steps, like just do these 5 steps and you're good. But we're talking principles, and sometimes the best way to like connect the dots or have that inspiration of saying, I could do that, right? And this is exactly why we do How I Lead interviews, is go read one of these books and learn about, go through the narrative of what it was like, what they do. And suddenly these little nuances will jump out and you'll say, I can do that, right? My interview with Kurt Brown, which is quickly becoming most downloaded. We actually won an award, a podcast award for this episode. And that's all we, it's not like he had this 5-step plan that was perfect, but there was these moments where these principles come out and you think, I can do that, right? And so people go back to those episodes thinking, yes, this is what good leadership looks like. I wonder if I can establish that in my own leadership. So really good stuff. But this plays into sort of that last part we talked about, being that the stage one is this concept of ego. And we had sort of an informal conversation a few weeks ago because I sent out a newsletter. I send out a newsletter every week. And if you're not on there, you can go to leadingsaints.org/subscribe and make sure you get the newsletter. It's actually become one of the more popular things about the Leading Saints brand. Some people read the newsletter and they're like, I didn't even know you had a podcast. Well, it's right there in the newsletter. But I talked about this concept of, as leaders, and you've given me words or a framework to touch in this. We go to that stage one of safety and comfort, where it's like, you know what, I've been asked to do this. I love the gospel. You just think of the richness that the gospel has blessed us with, the richness of our relationship with Jesus Christ and Heavenly Father. And I mean, all the all the things are just beautiful about our gospel. And so then we're asked to serve in a capacity. And sometimes maybe it's a quote unquote heavier capacity of bishop, relief society president, elders quorum president. You think, I want to do so well at this responsibility. Yes, I'm going to do it. And even if I have to stay up late or work overtime or whatever it is, like I want to do such a good job. And then naturally, as happens in mortality, our ego kind of gets intertangled with the experience of like, and if it doesn't go well, I guess that says something about my discipleship, or I guess that means that I'm kind of not as good of the person as the bishop is or the stake president is, because I obviously will never reach that level of influence or calling, right? And then we, one example that I'm often experiencing of like, it's easy to get stuck in this mode of thinking, all right, where are my ministering interviews at? I got to get 100. And sometimes I stop and say, Kurt, why do you got to get 100? Of course, we get it on paper, why that's an effective thing to do. But if I start to define myself with some of these things. But anyways, that was sort of the premise of my newsletter, that we have to just keep that in check. Recognize that our ego is there. And I'm a proponent that ego isn't just this negative thing. Like we're all born with ego. I'm sure there's some Latin roots that would better explain this.
Yep.
But the reality is we're blessed with an ego. I mean, the fact that I put together a podcast and did 800 episodes, I had the ego to actually do something like this, as if I could stimulate a conversation or have something to say that would bless the church and the world. But actually that ego became a great blessing to many leaders across the world, right? So ego is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can get in our way or get too intertangled with our experience. Where do you want to jump off with this conversation about ego?
Yeah, and here's one of my pet peeves about ego is it, as you allude to, it can be defined in a wide variety of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And it, depending on how we define it, kind of shapes whether we see the ego as being good versus bad, or helpful versus not. And the reality is I think all of us would say there's pros and cons associated with ego. And so maybe a direction I would like to go is just to simply suggest a redefining of ego in the context of the topics that we've talked about that might be helpful for us.
Awesome.
So the way that I would like to define ego, at least again, just for the purposes of this conversation, is our ego is any part of ourselves that causes us to focus on us and our own safety, security, or standing out, advancing, getting ahead, versus creating value for others. So if we are in this tension between, do I do something that makes me feel safe, or do I do something that's more inclined to create value in the long term? Which way do I value for others in the long term? Which way do I lean? Yeah. And anything, what I'm going to suggest is any part of ourselves that causes us to lean towards self-preservation as opposed to value creation is our ego getting in the way of leadership.
Yeah.
And of our leadership. And I say this by being incredibly I struggle with this as much as anybody. Right. So yes. While I might have some ideas on this, that doesn't mean I'm necessarily walking the talk. So I have my own issues that I've got to get over, but I don't know. I guess let me come back to you with that definition of saying any part of ourselves that causes us to move towards protecting ourselves and away from creating value from others is our ego getting in the way.
Yeah. Yeah. And this actually, I think it'll be the episode before this one. I actually do a whole episode talking about the concept of motivation, because this is like how to motivate people. And I've done other newsletter articles about this as well, but I wanted to create one episode that I could point people to that would really hit the nail on the head about this concept, because I get so many messages from people saying, why don't people do this stuff? Like, don't they know we're supposed to do ministering visits? Don't they know, like, the same time people can't do all the service assignments, right? And And so they're like, they want, just give me all you have about motivating people, whether it's manipulation, whether it's shame, like just give it to me, whatever it takes. I need to motivate people. And that's where we do sort of retreat to some of these negative places of like motivating through manipulation or shame, right? When I consider this, like the like my self-preservation, that is also in terms of, in a church calling, that's like maybe people will be so disappointed in how I lead that they'll just release me and they'll forget about
Mm.
me, right? They'll put me in the dustpan or put me out to pasture and say, well, we gave Brother Frankham a shot and that was a disappointment. So we'll never do that again. But at the same time, like I have to have the surety of walking in the stake president's office knowing that he may get after me, that I'm only at 70% of ministering interviews, and I have to say, you know what, if you need to find somebody else to do this calling, I'm okay with that. Right, but my ego says no, like just make sure you don't have to have that conversation, right? Like just do it, do whatever it takes to do it. But when in reality, if I mentioned that episode, I love my stake president. He doesn't approach me that way. But if he did, and I'd say, well, you just come to Elders Quorum and see what's happening there, because there's a culture dynamic there, regardless of how many ministering interviews are being done. Like something special is happening there, right? And so, anyways, that's where my mind goes. That I have to constantly remind myself. I have to disconnect myself from the numbers, from the key indicators, even though those are good, places to stretch and understand what's going on at times. But I don't need to be in a place of self-preservation. If they need someone else to do this gig, there's probably plenty others people to try.
Yeah. And as you're saying this, I kind of come back to my own, I look back on my own mission experience.
Oh yeah.
And, how we were incentivized, we were measured. Every night we were measured.
Yeah.
Essentially, how many discussions did you have today? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I would talk to somebody and they would kind of express, oh, life isn't going well, X, Y, and Z, honestly, rather than try to help them with their need, I'd be like, I've got a story for you. Let me tell you about Joseph Smith.
Yeah.
Right. And it was just like, ultimately, at the end of the day, what I was doing is I was making it, I was approaching them not to create value for them, but to create value for me, or to report a certain number for me at the end of the night.
Yeah.
And I'm, I could say that jokingly because I'm ashamed of that, but I'm also very forgiving of myself, and that's past self, and I still have my own issues. But that's kind of the idea, right? So it's one thing to be able to kind of say, do I have parts of myself that pull towards self-preservation as opposed to value creation? Mm-hmm. So that's a really powerful question. And honestly, it's led me to several years of therapy, which has been so incredibly growth promoting.
Yeah.
But a deeper question that we can even ask is, am I aware of the parts of me that are more wired for self-preservation as opposed to value creation?
Yeah.
And that opens up a lot, because the reality is that I just find that most leaders that I work with in organizations, they are not aware of their self-preservation tendencies. But if they were, I think that they might operate a little bit differently. And I would say the same thing about all of us.
Yeah. Let me mention something that sort of a way this sort of creeps up on people, and let me know if you agree with this, is sometimes people think, oh yeah, they're listening to this totally, Ryan and Kurt, I'm totally on board with this. And then we slip into this like fake humility place where it's like, yeah, and then we say things, I'm probably not a very good Elders Quorum president, or yeah, I can't even believe they picked me, right? We're trying to, and we do it a lot of times in a joking setting. And I'm even saying, like, I work to even get rid of that. Like, I never joke about the sort of the self-deprecation of like, yeah, I'm kind of a mess, and because I think that's the ego trying to convince us of, well, if I show people that I'm kind of already thinking about that I'm a failure, and then I become a failure, and then people know like, oh yeah, he knew what was going on, or I don't know. So when in reality, when we're in that sort of fake humility, or like, oh golly, like I just don't know what I'm doing here, like we may be missing that ego standpoint, or that we're maybe in a place of safety. but we're also not producing value for our organization
Mm-hmm.
when it's, and this is what I love about the stories, I think the hero with 1,000 faces, like what do they call that? Like, movies follow the storyline where the farm boy on a far off planet is called into this larger story to be a Jedi Knight, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that story comes from God. Like that is the Bible story, right? He went to
Yep.
Abraham, who was practically nothing, and he's like, you will have so many children, right? I'm not doing these Bible stories very well. Or Moses, who's like, man, I can't even talk. Like, yeah, well, you're going to go to Egypt and like free my children, right? So this
Mm-hmm.
this is like the power of that larger story of when we feel that calling. Like that's where when we have our ego in line, where it's like, no, like there's something larger than me, and I have the capacity through God to create a remarkable experience. Right? There's no fake humility in that. There's no like woe
Yeah.
is me or self-deprecation. And that's the sweet spot where it's like, I'm going to make a difference. And maybe this goes to like, I'm going to be a contributor, right? Because God's called
Yeah.
me to be a contributor, right? What put me in line there. Anything I'm off base there?
Well, no, it's just I'm going to use my terminology. I'm going to be a value creator,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
right? And that's what I'm intensely focused on. And to be here, look, if we're leveling up on these levels, here's one of the things that I've learned about leveling up is part of the process of doing this is healing and deepening our relationship with ourselves.
Yeah.
Right? What keeps people at lower altitudes in these levels is insecurities
Yeah.
and limiting beliefs and fears. And so at the end of the day, if we want to be this high level elevated leader, that's this gardener minded leader, we probably need to do some work on healing our relationship with ourselves at a foundational level. And I think that's, and that's, we can come back to the gospel. What's the purpose of the Christ's atonement? Is to help us foster that healing,
Yeah.
so that we could be more value creators.
Yeah. That's powerful. And then, there's that, the ego often wants to go to our quorum, go to our Relief Society, go to our ward as the leader and get that validation of like, oh, you're such a great bishop. You're such, but, and people have said this quote in different modes, but the modern day philosopher Lecrae, that's a joke because he's a Christian hip hop artist, but he said, if you give people the power to validate you, you also give them the power to invalidate you, right? And so if we go to
Yes.
our validation in our leadership, like if we need that pump of ego there, it can also deflate that ego and really cause us to spin out of control. The only source for our personal value is God. And so there's those moments where all I can do is get on my knees and say, all right, God, remind me one more time, like, do you love me? Like, am I worth
Yep.
what you say I'm worth? Like, am I really a child of God? Like, what's that divine identity that you bestowed upon me? So I do it.
Well, as you're saying this, I'm thinking there's several CEOs that I've worked with that come to mind, and one of them was actually fairly self-aware, but he was also not a very good leader. and as we dug into things, he's kind of this command and control, hierarchical, top-down leader. As we dug into it, one of the things that he said to me, I'll probably always stick with me. He says, "Deep down, I don't like myself."
Mm-hmm.
The reason why I push my team so hard is because I know that if we could get wins in the business world, it makes me feel like I'm of greater value.
Oof.
And at the end of the day, like he's never going to become a great leader until he gains a sense of self-worth, which he currently doesn't really have.
Yeah.
And I think, he's not alone. All of us have that to a certain degree. We all have a tendency to want to feel like we get confidence when others compliment us,
Mm-hmm.
which may seek us or cause us to seek compliments. Or I once had a stake president who was maybe the funniest person that I know, and he was always telling jokes.
Uh-huh.
But I also recognized, I think it was a way for him to mask his own insecurities.
Mm-hmm.
Like if somebody brought up something controversial, he would be quick to tell a joke to diffuse any tension.
Yeah.
And I just think he had a hard time sitting in that. I think he had a hard time sitting in the tension. And I think everybody loved him because he was so funny. But at the same time, I think people felt like they were never heard by him.
Yeah, and that's where that self-awareness comes in, of just asking people, because it's so hard to see that sometimes from this side of your eyeballs, but to get feedback from others to be more self-aware really goes a long way. So,
And let me
yeah.
add, if it's okay, just really quickly, just a theme that I see across the executives that I work with is when I do 360 feedback with leaders, I ask a wide variety of questions. There's one question that leaders always score the lowest in.
And explain what 360 feedback is.
So 360 feedback is when, if I'm a leader, I have my subordinates, my peers, and my boss give me feedback about how I show up in the workplace. And so wide variety of questions. There's one question where leaders always score rather low in. And the question is, to what degree is this leader good at being vulnerable?
Mm.
The question is not great at being vulnerable. It's good at being vulnerable. There's already a low bar. And most leaders struggle with vulnerability.
Yeah.
That maybe shouldn't surprise us. But connecting to this topic of ego, the reason why I bring it up is I think that most people struggle with vulnerability. And vulnerability, if we are unwilling to be vulnerable, that is a signal that we prefer to lean towards self-protection versus value creation. Because I don't know about you, but vulnerability is where relationships get built. That's where trust gets built. That's when impact happens, is in when we're vulnerable. And I've kind of had to learn this the hard way myself, and I'm still not great at it. But I've had to learn I'm not naturally a very vulnerable person. And I would say maybe particularly with my wife.
Hmm.
And so in our relationship over we've been married 14 years, almost 15 years, I've come to see how I tend to lean towards not being vulnerable because it helps me to not feel uncomfortable in that moment where I could have been vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
But the cost of leaning towards not being vulnerable has been a reduced connection with my wife. And so that's it. I think whether it's with relationships, the people that we lead, or the groups that we lead, I think a common place where leaders struggle and have this egoic self-protection tendency is to move away from vulnerability as opposed to step into vulnerability.
Yeah.
And I think that might be an interesting way to consider, what is my altitude of my leadership, by gauging how willing am I to be vulnerable.
Yeah. All right. So, and vulnerability is sort of becoming a buzzword these days, and so sometimes we miss the we miss the principle just because it's such a high level. Give us a crash course. What comes to mind? It's like, okay, I'm a leader. I want to be vulnerable. Like, what do I do? Do I talk about like my terrible childhood? Do I talk about my tough week? Like, how do I be vulnerable?
Yeah, well, and I love the way that Brene Brown talks about it. She talks about it in terms of removing your armor. And I don't think there's one right way to do that. But it is I think one part of it, it's creating openness and space for others, and even for ourselves. But here's another way. This is something I've had to learn as part of my relationship with my wife. But I had one of my MBA students is having a tough time with this student group at the moment. And he sends me an email and he says, can you put me in a different group? I'm not having a good experience with this group. And I essentially said, no, I can't do that. But there's some things that I think you could do to improve your situation. And one of the things that he expressed to me was, I feel like my group doesn't listen to me. I say something and I feel like they dismiss what I say. And I asked him, have you told your group members that? And he said, well, no. And I think that's a place of vulnerability, right? It would be incredibly vulnerable for him to say, hey, group members, I'm not feeling like you guys are valuing my voice. And that's where he just needs to stop. Stop there. Like, I don't feel like you're valuing my voice. That's incredible. That's lowering his armor, exposing himself in a very vulnerable way. But what he would be doing is he would be seeing, will they catch me when I express a sincere need?
Mm.
And if they were to catch him, then that would help build the relationship. But if he never expresses to them this concern that they're not listening to him, nothing is going to change.
Yeah.
So in order for change to occur, I think almost all change is preceded by some form of vulnerability. Again, so that doesn't mean that we're airing our dirty laundry, but in order for us to deepen our relationship and connection with others and to have an impact in the lives of others, it has got to come from a place of vulnerability.
Yeah. I just recently heard a story, a real life story of in an elders quorum meeting. The elders, I don't know what the setting was or how he got to this point, but there was a moment where the elders quorum president got really vulnerable and said, I feel like I'm failing as an elders quorum president. Now,
Yeah.
naturally, and this happened, we want to like, oh, don't worry about it. You're great. You're wonderful. Keep going, which is good. But, he put himself out there basically saying, will you catch me? I feel like I'm failing. Right. And it's not, he didn't then spin it into a guilt trip. And that's why you need to do A, B, and C. It was just like, this is where I am as in my humanity. Right. And from what I heard, it turned out to be a really vulnerable discussion and one that really kind of moved the quorum to that next stage as an organization. Another thing I do at the end of my quorum meetings as elders quorum president is I make sure that we wrap up the discussion about 10 minutes before, 7 to 10 minutes before the end of the class, and everybody's circled up, and I say, I want to know how we as a quorum can pray for you this week. And I usually lead out with, here is what I am struggling with, right? And, depending on the week as far as what I share, so I lead out as a leader, and then I say, anybody else here, how can we pray for you? This week we had a guy raise his hand and say, business is not going well for me. And, we're living off our savings right now, and I could really use some help, right? And it's, and we usually get, and sometimes I'll just sit there and it'll be silent for 30 seconds until someone raises their hand and when they feel comfortable. But then we pray as a quorum. I'll call in somebody to then pray. And it's a beautiful experience of these human, mortals coming together in worship and saying, I need some help here. And as a quorum, we're praying for them. And we may not specifically say, bless Johnny there, that his job can get better, but it's been stated, and it really has stimulated a more openness and safety, psychological safety, I hope, sure, in the quorum. So.
Oh man, I love that. I love everything about that. Right. And I just imagine, I'm sure you have great teachers and they do great things, but I'm sure I'm guessing that is more impactful on the people in the quorum than any lesson that could be delivered.
Yeah.
As good of any lesson could be.
Yeah, I hope so. Anything else, Ryan, that we missed? Ego, anything? I mean,
in terms of so what are some practical suggestions that people can have as a result of our conversation? And here's some questions to consider in addition to the ones that we've already talked about. So one question is, are you as a leader creating space for learning and for new ideas? Right. That might be a valuable question. Another question is, have you developed a clear purpose that is about creating value? And just side note on this is, I do think that if we're going to create a purpose statement, it shouldn't just be me creating it and then top down delivering it to my group. It should be in partnership with the group that I lead. And then another question, similar question is, am I in learning mode, performance mode, or safety mode? Right? Safety mode is, am I just doing like the minimum for my stewardship to just make sure we're not rocking the boat? Performance mode might be, am I getting all of my interviews done? And learning mode is this mode of, how can we make the culture one that is more optimal for our people to grow and to thrive?
Love it.
And I think there's kind of a higher order nature to that.
Yeah, perfect. Cool. I'll ask you two more questions. One being, if people want to know more about your books, obviously they're on Amazon or your consulting work or anything like that, where would you send them?
Yeah, best place is my website, ryangottfredson.com. In fact, there's a couple of self-assessments that are on that website that many of the Leading States members have taken, and I've gotten feedback from them about how it's been very eye-opening to kind of awaken to their self-protective tendencies and how they can be more value-creating. So there's a couple of assessments there that I think if you're listening, and you want to deepen your self-awareness, I think those will be valuable tools for you. And then, like you said, I've got some books to support people in terms of making some shifts in these regards.
Awesome. And then lastly, just what final encouragement after all these things we've talked about, the three levels, the five responses or whatever, like what's some final encouragement you give to this group of leaders who just want to do better and be better leaders?
Yeah, well, I hope one of the ideas, maybe there's two core ideas that I hope people connect with. One is the notion of gardener-minded leadership. How are you doing as a gardener within your garden? How intensely focused are you on cultivating the right conditions for your people to grow and thrive? That includes your family, right? That's an easy place to start. The other piece of this is just the idea of, ultimately, if we want to be these gardener-minded leaders, we might need to do some work on healing our relationship with ourselves. And I want to, I hope people will be open to taking steps to be able to do that, whatever that might be. Surely Christ is a source of that. As I've mentioned, therapy has been a very valuable part of my journey, or even having coaches and mentors that could guide me in terms of healing that relationship. But I think at the end of the day, that's if we don't have a good relationship with ourselves, it's going to be hard for us to have a positive impact on the lives of others. And I think that's something all of us aspire to.